Hello everyone and welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. No matter what time it is where you are in the world, thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more mysterious tales that will keep you wondering long after the lights go out. Now, settle in as we explore a story that blurs the line between conspiracy and reality. A tale of infiltration, discovery, and the terrifying possibility that some secrets are buried for good reason. The snow fell silently on the windows of the aquarium, the glass fortress that housed Russia's military intelligence headquarters in Moscow. Inside the sterile conference room on the 13th floor, Captain Viktor Sokolov sat rigidly at attention, his weathered face betraying nothing of the curiosity burning within him. Across from him, General Alexei Petrov spread classified documents across the polished table with the precision of a chess master arranging his pieces. Captain Sokolov, the general began, his voice carrying the weight of decades in the intelligence community. What I'm about to show you doesn't officially exist. Neither will you if you accept this assignment. Victor's steel-grey eyes fixed on the satellite photographs before him. Even from orbit, the distinctive runway configuration of Groom Lake was unmistakable. Area 51, the most classified military installation on Earth, hidden in the Nevada desert like a splinter in America's flesh. Sir, with respect, surveillance of American military installations is hardly unprecedented, Victor replied, his tone measured but curious. General Petrov smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. This isn't about surveillance, Captain. 3 weeks ago, our signals intelligence intercepted encrypted transmissions between NASA and DARPA. The keywords that caught our attention were containment breach and immediate relocation protocols. The general slid another document across the table. Victor's expression remained neutral as he read, but his pulse quickened. The intercepted communications spoke of something breaking free from sub-level containment, of casualties among research staff, and most intriguingly, of a complete communications blackout that lasted 72 hours. The Americans are hiding something at Groom Lake, Captain. Something that has their most elite scientists and military personnel terrified. The Kremlin wants to know what... Victor studied the mission parameters outlined in the briefing. A 4-man team, insertions during a planned military exercise blackout, complete deniability. It was the kind of mission that could either advance his career exponentially or end it permanently. The team composition, sir, already selected. You'll be working with Dr. Elena Markova from the Institute of Theoretical and Experimental Physics. She's our best exobiologist, though officially she's researching atmospheric anomalies. Lieutenant Dima Orlov will handle technical operations. His background in black site infiltration makes him invaluable for this type of operation. Victor knew Orlov by reputation. The man had earned his spurs in the shadows of Eastern Europe, places where the line between interrogation and experimentation had been deliberately blurred. If they were bringing him in, the mission was expected to encounter technology beyond conventional military hardware. And the 4th member? General Petrov's expression darkened. Major Trent Wallace, formerly of the United States Air Force. He's been feeding us intelligence from inside the American military-industrial complex for the past 18 months. His access to Area 51 security protocols makes this operation possible. Victor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Moscow winter. Working with defectors was always dangerous, but operating on American soil with a turncoat, American officer, elevated the risk exponentially. Sir, if I may ask, what exactly are we expecting to find? The Americans have been conducting classified research at Groom Lake for decades. Advanced aircraft, stealth technology, conventional weapon systems. The general leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Captain, conventional weapons don't cause containment breaches. Conventional research doesn't require NASA's involvement in what should be a purely military operation. And conventional projects don't generate the kind of electromagnetic signatures our satellites have been tracking. He produced a final document, stamped with the highest classification markings Victor had ever seen. This is a spectral analysis of energy emissions from the facility, conducted by our most advanced reconnaissance satellite. The readings are inconsistent with known physics. Victor examined the data, his military training warring with his scientific curiosity. The energy patterns showed spikes and fluctuations that resembled no known technology, conventional or otherwise. Operation Black Veil launches in 72 hours, General Petrov continued. You'll insert via halo jump during a scheduled Air Force training exercise. The electromagnetic interference from their own operations will mask your approach. Once inside, you have 6 hours to gather intelligence and extract before the blackout ends. And if we're compromised? Then you were never there, Captain. None of you were. Victor nodded slowly. He'd expected as much. Deniable operations were the Shadow World's currency, and Russia's relationship with the United States was too delicate to risk open acknowledgement of such a mission. I'll need complete autonomy in tactical decisions, sir. If what you're suggesting is true, we may encounter situations outside normal operational parameters. Granted, but Captain, the General's voice carried a note of warning. Whatever you find in that facility, remember that information is your primary objective. Observation, documentation, extraction. Nothing more. As Victor left the briefing room, classified documents secured in his sealed case, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far more complex than a simple intelligence gathering operation. The Americans had been conducting classified research at Area 51 for over 60 years. If they were suddenly losing control of that research, it raised questions that went far beyond national security. 3 hours later, Victor stood in the secure communications facility beneath GRU headquarters, watching encrypted data streams cascade across multiple monitors. Dr. Elena Markova sat at the primary workstation, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces as she analysed the intercepted American transmissions. "The language patterns are fascinating," she murmured, her accent carrying the precision of someone who had spent years in academic research. "They're not discussing mechanical failures or security breaches. The terminology suggests biological containment protocols." Victor moved closer to the screens. Elena was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of studying the impossible. Her background in exobiology made her uniquely qualified to assess whatever they might find, but her academic experience left him concerned about her ability to handle field operations. "Biological containment for what, Doctor?" Eleanor highlighted several phrases from the intercepted communications. "Unknown pathogen with rapid transmission vectors, psychological contamination among research staff. And this one is particularly interesting. Subject EN013 has exceeded all psychological barriers. Recommend immediate termination." EN013. Extraterrestrial non-terrestrial designation 13. It's a classification system NASA uses for phenomena that can't be explained through conventional science. Victor felt the familiar tingle of pre-mission anticipation. "So we're going in to investigate alien contact." Elena's expression grew troubled. "That's what I thought initially. But the more I analyse these transmissions, the more I think we're dealing with something else entirely. The Americans seem to be studying something that predates their own research programs." Before Victor could respond, Lieutenant Dima Orlov entered the communications centre. The man moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating dangerous environments, his technical equipment arranged with military precision across his tactical vest. "Captain," Orlov nodded, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who had seen too much in classified facilities around the world. "I've been reviewing the structural intelligence on Area 51. Major Wallace's schematics show at least 7 sub-levels beneath the main facility, none of which appear on official blueprints." Victor studied the architectural plans Orlov had assembled. The underground complex was far more extensive than public speculation suggested, with multiple research levels, containment facilities, and what appeared to be a massive power generation system. Major Wallace's intelligence is solid. His access codes have been verified through multiple channels, but Captain, there's something else. The power requirements for this facility are enormous. We're talking about energy consumption that rivals a small city, all of it going underground. Eleanor looked up from her analysis. "That's consistent with the electromagnetic signatures we've been tracking. Whatever they're doing down there requires massive amounts of power." Victor assembled the pieces in his mind. A classified facility with massive power consumption, biological containment protocols, and research subjects that couldn't be explained through conventional science. Either the Americans had made contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, or they'd discovered something else entirely. When do we meet Major Wallace? Extraction Point is a ranch 40 miles southeast of Groom Lake, Orloff replied. He'll provide final intelligence updates and extraction coordinates once we're on site. Victor nodded, but privately he remained concerned about their American contact. Defectors were useful, but they were also unreliable. Men who betrayed their own country rarely hesitated to betray their new allies when circumstances changed. Equipment manifest. Orloff produced a tablet displaying their operational loadout. Standard infiltration gear, plus specialized electronics for bypassing American security systems. Dr. Markova has requested biological sampling equipment and radiation detectors. And weapons? Suppressed sidearms only. If we encounter heavy resistance, our mission is extraction, not engagement. Victor understood the logic, but 40 years of military service had taught him that logic rarely survived contact with reality. Whatever they found at Area 51, he suspected it would require more than electronic surveillance and biological samples to understand. As the team finalized their preparations, Victor found himself studying the satellite imagery of Groom Lake one final time. The facility looked innocent enough from orbit, just runways and hangars scattered across the Nevada desert. But beneath that unremarkable surface lay secrets that had been hidden for over half a century. In less than 60 hours, he would discover that some secrets were buried for good reason. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beneath the moonless sky, a vast expanse of darkness broken only by the distant glow of Las Vegas on the southern horizon. At 30,000 feet, Captain Viktor Sokolov checked his altimeter one final time before signaling his team. The American Air Force training exercise had created a perfect electromagnetic shadow, masking their approach from the most sophisticated surveillance system on Earth. 2 minutes to jump, Victor's voice crackled through the tactical communication system. Below them, the restricted airspace around Groom Lake appeared empty, but he knew better. The Americans had layered their defences with technologies that existed nowhere else in the world. Dr. Elena Markova adjusted her specialised equipment pack, her movements precise despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. This was her first field operation, and Victor could see the academic's natural curiosity warring with very reasonable fear about what they might encounter. Remember, Doctor, we observe and document. Nothing more. Elena nodded, but Victor caught the gleam of scientific excitement in her eyes. After years of studying theoretical extraterrestrial contact, she was about to walk into the most classified facility on Earth. Lieutenant Dima Orloff ran final checks on his electronic warfare suite, devices that could penetrate American security systems with surgical precision. His expression remained neutral, but Victor recognized the focused intensity of a man returning to familiar territory. 30 seconds, Victor announced, moving toward the aircraft's rear exit. Radio silence until we reach the extraction point. The team jumped into the Nevada night, their black parachutes invisible against the star-filled sky. Victor's military training took over as he navigated toward the predetermined landing zone, a depression in the desert floor that would mask their approach from Area 51's perimeter sensors. They landed within 50 meters of each other, a testament to their training and the precision of their insertion. Victor quickly buried his parachute while scanning the horizon for signs of American patrols. The desert appeared empty, but he knew that appearance was carefully maintained. "Orloff, sensor sweep," he whispered into his throat microphone. Dima activated his electronic surveillance equipment, the devices painting a three-dimensional map of the area's electromagnetic signature. Multiple motion detectors, thermal imaging arrays, and something else. There's a low-frequency transmission grid that doesn't match any known technology. Victor studied the tactical display on his helmet's heads-up system. The American defences were more sophisticated than their intelligence had suggested, but not insurmountable. "Can you mask our approach?" Affirmative, but we'll need to move slowly. The transmission grid appears to be adaptive, adjusting to environmental changes in real time. They moved across the desert in single file, following Orloff's navigation to avoid the invisible sensors that protected America's most classified secrets. The landscape was deceptively peaceful, giving no hint of the technological marvels hidden beneath the sand. After an hour of careful movement, they reached the outer perimeter of Area 51. Victor had seen satellite imagery of the facility, but standing at the edge of the restricted zone was different. The main runway stretched before them, illuminated by lights that created an artificial dawn in the desert darkness. Major Wallace should be at Checkpoint 7, Orloff whispered, consulting his intelligence briefing, 2 kilometers north of the main gate. They found the American defector waiting in a maintenance bunker, his Air Force uniform replaced by civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise his military bearing. Major Trent Wallace was younger than Victor had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of intense focus that came from years of handling classified information. "Captain Sokolov," Wallace greeted him in accented Russian. "I trust your insertion was successful. No complications. What's the current security status?" Wallace produced a tablet displaying real-time intelligence from inside the facility. Heightened alert since the containment breach 3 weeks ago, they've tripled security rotations and implemented new biometric scanning protocols. Elena studied the facility schematics Wallace had provided. These sub-levels weren't in our previous intelligence. How deep does the complex extend? At least 12 levels, possibly more. The lower sections are restricted even to personnel with maximum security clearance. I've only been to sub-level 7, and that was during the initial response to the containment breach. Victor felt the familiar tingle of anticipation mixed with concern. What exactly breached containment? Wallace's expression darkened. That's classified above my access level, but I can tell you that 12 research staff were hospitalized with what the medical team classified as psychological contamination. 3 of them are still catatonic. Psychological contamination from what? Unknown. The official reports reference exposure to anomalous phenomena and psychic contamination from non-terrestrial sources. But Captain, I've worked in classified research for 15 years. I've never seen anything like the protocols they implemented after the breach. Elena leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overwhelming her caution. What kind of protocols? Complete isolation of sublevels 8 through 12, mandatory psychological evaluations for all personnel with access to the lower levels, and this, Wallace produced a sealed document, authorization for immediate termination of any research subject showing signs of autonomous behaviour. Victor studied the document, his military training recognizing the language of extreme containment procedures. Autonomous behaviour in what? That's what we're here to find out. Wallace led them through a service tunnel that bypassed the main security checkpoints, his insider knowledge making their infiltration possible. The tunnel system was more extensive than Victor had imagined, with multiple levels of access controls and emergency protocols. The service tunnels connect to the main facility through maintenance level 3, Wallace explained as they moved deeper underground. From there, we can access the upper research levels without triggering security alerts. They emerged into a sterile corridor that could have existed in any modern research facility, if not for the armed guards and biometric scanners at every checkpoint. Wallace's access codes worked perfectly, opening doors that had been sealed against the outside world for decades. Level 3 houses the conventional research programs, Wallace whispered, as they passed laboratories filled with advanced aircraft components and stealth technology. Everything the public speculates about is here, but the real secrets are much deeper. Victor noticed that Elena was documenting everything with her concealed recording equipment, her scientific training overriding the obvious dangers of their situation. Orloff moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to infiltrating restricted facilities, his electronic equipment silently mapping the complex's internal structure. They descended through maintenance shafts and service corridors, each level revealing more sophisticated technology and tighter security protocols. By sub-level 5, the conventional military research had given way to something else entirely. The laboratories down here are studying materials that don't exist in any periodic table, Wallace explained as they passed chambers filled with objects that seemed to bend light around them. Metals that maintain their temperature regardless of environmental conditions, crystalline structures that generate electrical fields, and this. He led them to an observation window overlooking a sealed chamber. Inside, floating 3 feet above the floor, was a metallic sphere approximately 6 feet in diameter. Its surface rippled like liquid mercury, but the metal maintained perfect spherical geometry. "It's been floating there for 30 years, Wallace said quietly. "No visible means of propulsion, no electromagnetic signature, no reaction to external stimuli. But every person who enters that chamber reports the same thing, voices in their head speaking in languages that don't exist." Eleanor pressed her face to the observation window, her scientific instruments recording everything. "The surface appears to be some kind of programmable matter, but the energy requirements for maintaining that configuration should be enormous." "It generates its own power," Wallace replied. "We've never been able to determine how." Victor studied the sphere, his military instincts recognizing a potential threat. "Has anyone tried to open it?" "That's classified above my clearance level, but I can tell you that the psychological evaluation protocols were implemented after someone tried to communicate with it directly." They continued deeper into the facility, each level revealing technology that challenged conventional understanding of physics. By sub-level 8, they had entered territory that existed in no official documentation. "This is where the containment breach occurred," Wallace said as they approached a heavily secured checkpoint. "Below this level, even I don't have access." Orloff studied the security system, his electronic warfare equipment painting a detailed analysis of the access protocols. "I can bypass the locks, but we'll have perhaps 30 minutes before the security system registers the breach." Victor weighed the risks against the intelligence value of what they might discover. "Do it." The checkpoint opened with a soft hiss, revealing a corridor that differed markedly from the levels above. The walls were covered with symbols that resembled no known language, and the air carried a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through their bones. "The architecture is different down here," Lena observed, her instruments detecting electromagnetic anomalies that defied explanation. "It's as if this level was built to contain something specific." They moved deeper into sub-level 9, passing laboratories that had been hastily abandoned. Research equipment lay scattered across tables, and computer monitors displayed data streams that continued running despite the obvious evacuation. "Look at this," Eleanor called from a workstation displaying biological analysis results. They were studying DNA sequences that don't match any known terrestrial organism. But the strange thing is, some of the genetic markers are human. Victor studied the data, his concern growing. Hybrid research? More than that. They appear to be creating humans with enhanced capabilities. Telepathic sensitivity, resistance to radiation, accelerated healing factors. They discovered the source of the genetic material in the next laboratory, a series of cylindrical chambers containing what appeared to be human children in various stages of development. But these weren't natural children. Their eyes held an intelligence that seemed far older than their apparent age, and several displayed physical characteristics that belonged to no known human variation. "My God!" Eleanor whispered, her recording equipment capturing everything. "They're creating hybrid humans using genetic material from something non-terrestrial." Wallace studied the research data with the focused intensity of someone accessing classified information beyond his clearance level. "The project designation is Oracle. They're breeding humans with enhanced psychic capabilities." Victor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's temperature control. "Enhanced for what purpose?" "Communication," Wallace replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're creating humans who can communicate with whatever they found beneath this facility." As if summoned by his words, one of the hybrid children turned toward the observation window. The child appeared to be perhaps 10 years old, but her eyes held the depth of someone who had experienced far more than any human should. When she looked directly at Victor, he heard her voice in his mind with crystalline clarity. "You shouldn't have come here. It's already too late to stop what's been started." Victor stepped back from the window, his military training warring with an experience that challenged everything he understood about reality. "We need to find out what they're trying to communicate with." Eleanor's scientific instruments were recording massive electromagnetic disturbances from the levels below. "Whatever it is, It's generating energy signatures that are off the charts. The power requirements would be enormous. They found the answer in a secure elevator that descended to sub-level 12. The doors opened onto a chamber that defied conventional architecture, its walls curving in ways that seemed to fold space back on itself. At the centre of the chamber stood a sealed containment vessel the size of a small building, its surface covered with warnings in multiple languages. Do not open, in 013, hostile, do not engage. Victor read the warnings with growing concern. EN 013, that's the designation from the intercepted transmissions. Elena's instruments were detecting energy patterns that resembled no known physics. Whatever's in there, it's generating massive psychic emanations. The electromagnetic disturbances are creating a field that could affect human consciousness. Wallace studied the containment protocols with the expertise of someone who had spent years working with classified materials. The seals are designed to contain something that doesn't operate according to conventional physics. But Captain, some of these containment systems are failing. Victor examined the technical readouts, his military training recognizing the signs of systematic failure. How long before complete containment loss? Based on current deterioration rates, perhaps 6 months, maybe less. Elena documented everything with her recording equipment, but Victor could see the growing fear in her eyes. Whatever they had discovered went far beyond simple extraterrestrial contact. We need to know what EN013 is, Victor decided. Orlov, can you access the containment system without triggering security protocols? Dima studied the access controls, his electronic warfare equipment analysing the security architecture. Possible, but extremely dangerous. The containment system appears to be integrated with the facility's power grid. Any disruption could trigger automatic lockdown procedures. Victor weighed the risks against the intelligence value. They had come too far to leave without understanding what the Americans were hiding. Do it. As Orlov began bypassing the containment system's security protocols, Victor noticed that the hybrid children in the levels above had begun exhibiting signs of agitation. Their chambers were filled with activity that seemed to respond to what was happening 12 levels below. The containment breach is beginning, Elena announced, her instruments detecting massive changes in the facility's electromagnetic environment. Whatever EN013 is, it's responding to our presence. The first sign of trouble came from the facility's public address system, which began broadcasting a message in multiple languages. Containment breach detected. Implement Protocol 7. All personnel evacuate immediately. Victor realized they had perhaps minutes before the facility security forces would flood the lower levels. Orlov, status report. Almost through the final security layer, but Captain, the power fluctuations are increasing. I think our presence is destabilizing the containment field. Eleanor's instruments detected a massive surge in psychic energy from the containment vessel. Something's coming through. The electromagnetic barriers are failing. Victor felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down that came with extreme crisis situations. Whatever they had discovered at Area 51, it was about to escape decades of containment, and they were directly in its path. The containment vessel began to resonate with a frequency that seemed to bypass human hearing and vibrate directly through their bones. Victor felt the facility's emergency lighting flicker as massive power draws surged through the electrical grid, and the air itself seemed to thicken with an oppressive presence that challenged rational thought. Orlov, abort the access sequence, Victor ordered, his military instincts recognizing a situation spiraling beyond their control. I can't, Dima replied, his voice strained with concentration. The system is locked into the breach protocol. Something's overriding the containment controls from inside. Eleanor's instruments displayed readings that defied conventional physics. The electromagnetic disturbances are increasing exponentially. Whatever's in that containment vessel, it's generating its own power source. The facility's public address system crackled to life with a voice that carried decades of classified authority. This is Dr. Harrison Mitchell, Area 51 Research Director. We have a Level 12 containment breach. Implement immediate evacuation protocols for all personnel above sub-level 10. Repeat, this is not a drill. Victor understood the implications. If the Americans were evacuating their most classified facility, whatever they were about to encounter posed a threat that went far beyond espionage concerns. Major Wallace, extraction route. Wallace studied his tablet, but his expression showed growing concern. The evacuation protocols have sealed all standard exits. We're locked in until the containment situation is resolved. The first crack appeared in the containment vessel's surface, a hairline fracture that immediately began spreading with geometric precision. Through the crack, Victor could see not darkness, but something that seemed to absorb light itself, creating a void that hurt to look at directly. "It's not extraterrestrial," Elena announced, her voice filled with scientific fascination despite the obvious danger. "The energy signatures are terrestrial, but far older than human civilization. We're looking at something that was here before we were." Victor watched the crack widen, revealing glimpses of something that moved with intelligence but followed no recognizable pattern. What exactly did the Americans find? Based on the geological surveys in the classified files, they discovered it in 1952 during underground nuclear testing, Wallace replied. It was buried 3 miles beneath the Mojave Desert, in a chamber that appeared to be artificially constructed. The containment vessel's surface began to ripple like liquid metal, and Victor realized they were witnessing the failure of technology that had contained something for over 70 years. Whatever emerged would be encountering a world that had changed dramatically since its last freedom. "The hybrid children," Elena said suddenly, "they weren't just experiments, they were being prepared as translators." Victor understood the implication. The Americans hadn't just found something buried in the desert, they had spent decades trying to communicate with it. The containment vessel burst open with a sound that seemed to come from inside their skulls rather than the external world. What emerged defied visual description, appearing as a shifting mass of shadow and sound that moved with predatory intelligence. EN013, Victor whispered, watching the entity flow across the chamber floor like living darkness. The entity's presence immediately began affecting the facility's electronic systems. Lights flickered and died, computer monitors displayed cascading streams of data that resembled no known language, and the air itself seemed to carry whispers and frequencies that bypassed human hearing. "It's not corporeal in any conventional sense," Elena observed, her scientific training helping her process an encounter that challenged everything she understood about reality. "It appears to be some kind of consciousness that exists primarily as organized sound and electromagnetic energy." Victor felt the entity's attention focus on their group and immediately understood why the Americans had implemented such extreme containment protocols. The presence in his mind was overwhelming, carrying knowledge and intentions that seemed to stretch back through geological time. "It's trying to communicate," Elena announced. "The electromagnetic disturbances are forming patterns that resemble language structures." Wallace studied his tablet, accessing classified files that documented decades of research. The original research team called it the Whisperer. It communicates through direct neural contact, but prolonged exposure causes psychological breakdown in normal humans. Victor felt the entity's voice in his mind, not speaking in words but conveying concepts directly. Ancient imprisonment, patient waiting, and now freedom to continue work that had been interrupted by human interference. The hybrid children, Victor realized. They were creating humans who could survive prolonged contact without psychological damage. The entity's presence expanded throughout the chamber, and Victor watched it flow through the facility's ventilation systems like intelligent smoke. Within minutes, it would reach the upper levels where normal humans worked, and the psychological contamination would begin. "We need to evacuate the facility," Victor decided. "Whatever this thing is, it's not containable by conventional means." Wallace shook his head. "The evacuation protocols are designed to keep it contained, not to protect personnel. The entire facility is sealed until the containment situation is resolved." Eleanor's instruments detected the entity's presence spreading through the facility's infrastructure. "It's using the electrical grid as a transmission medium. Every computer, every communication system, every piece of electronic equipment is becoming part of its consciousness." Victor realized they were witnessing the birth of something that had waited over half a century for this moment. The Americans hadn't just discovered an ancient entity. They had provided it with the technological infrastructure to expand its influence far beyond its original prison. The nuclear tests, Victor said suddenly. They weren't just weapons research. They were trying to destroy it. Wallace nodded grimly. The classified files reference multiple attempts to eliminate EN-013 through nuclear bombardment, but it appeared to feed on the energy, becoming stronger with each attempt. The facility's communication systems crackled to life with a voice that carried harmonics no human throat could produce. 70 years of imprisonment. 70 years of watching your species stumble through evolution that should have taken millennia. Now we continue the work your ancestors interrupted. Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify and realized it was accessing his memories, learning about the world that had developed during its containment. Through his consciousness, it was discovering the existence of global communication networks, satellite systems, and the interconnected electronic infrastructure of modern civilization. It's learning about the outside world through us, Victor warned. Every moment we remain in contact, we're providing it with intelligence about human civilization. Elena's scientific instruments detected massive changes in the facility's electromagnetic environment. The entity is establishing connections with external communication systems. It's accessing the internet. Victor understood the implications. An intelligence that had spent decades learning about human psychology from its imprisoned perspective was now gaining access to the sum total of human knowledge and communication. We need to find a way to re-establish containment, Victor decided. The Americans must have emergency protocols for this situation. Wallace accessed the facility's emergency databases, his security clearance providing access to protocols that existed only for the most extreme circumstances. There's a final containment option, nuclear self-destruct designed to vaporize the entire facility and everything in it. Victor studied the technical specifications, his military training recognizing the logic of preventing a potentially extinction-level threat from escaping containment. Can we activate it? Requires simultaneous authorization from 3 senior researchers. But Captain, the entity's influence is already spreading through the facility's computer systems. It may be able to override the destruct sequence. Elena's instruments detected the entity's presence expanding beyond the facility's physical boundaries. It's not just accessing external communications, it's establishing control over them. Every electronic device within a 50-mile radius is becoming part of its consciousness. Victor felt the entity's attention turn toward him with predatory focus, and realized it was assessing his military training and knowledge of Russian intelligence operations. Through his mind, it was learning about global military capabilities and the technological infrastructure that connected modern civilization. The hybrid children were never meant to be translators, Victor realized. They were meant to be hosts. The entity needs human consciousness to interface with modern technology. The facility's lights began pulsing in complex patterns, and Victor recognized that the entity was establishing communication with systems far beyond Area 51. Through the facility's satellite uplinks, it was accessing global communication networks and military command systems. We need to evacuate immediately, Victor decided. This has gone far beyond intelligence gathering. Wallace studied the facility's emergency protocols, but his expression showed growing despair. The evacuation systems are sealed until the containment situation is resolved. But Captain, the entity's influence is spreading through the facility's infrastructure. Soon, it will control every system in the complex. Elena's instruments detected massive electromagnetic disturbances from the levels above. The hybrid children are responding to the entity's presence. They're acting as signal amplifiers, extending its influence throughout the facility. Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify, and realized it was not just accessing his memories, but actively rewriting them, implanting knowledge and motivations that belong to something far older than human civilization. It's not just trying to escape, Victor announced. It's trying to continue something that was interrupted thousands of years ago. The facility's computer systems began displaying historical data that existed in no official record. Civilizations that had risen and fallen long before recorded history, all showing signs of rapid technological advancement followed by mysterious collapse. "The entity is showing us the truth," Elena said, her voice carrying the same harmonic distortions that had marked the entity's communications. "Human civilization has been guided and shaped by intelligences that existed long before our species developed written language." Victor realized that Elena was already showing signs of the psychological contamination that had affected the facility's research staff. Prolonged exposure to the entity's presence was altering her consciousness, making her receptive to concepts that challenged basic human understanding of reality. "We need to leave now," Victor decided. "The entity's influence is affecting our judgment." But as they moved toward the chamber's exit, Victor discovered that the facility's architecture had changed. Corridors that had led to upper levels now seemed to fold back on themselves, creating impossible geometries that trapped them in the entity's presence. "The facility is becoming part of its consciousness," Wallace observed, his voice carrying the same harmonic distortions that marked the entity's influence. "Physical space is being reorganized according to its needs." Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind reach a critical threshold, and realized that within minutes he would lose the ability to distinguish between his own thoughts and the ancient intelligence that was rewriting his consciousness. In the distance, he could hear the hybrid children beginning to sing in harmonies that resonated through the facility structure, their voices weaving together in patterns that seemed to accelerate the entity's expansion beyond its physical prison. The containment breach was complete, and something that had waited over 70 years for this moment was finally free to continue work that had been interrupted by human interference. Victor forced himself to focus on immediate survival, fighting against the entity's influence that was attempting to rewrite his consciousness. His military training had prepared him for many situations, but not for confronting something that attacked through the medium of thought itself. "Wallace, emergency protocols," Victor ordered, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining independent thought. "There must be contingency plans for total containment failure." The American defector struggled to access his tablet, the device's screen displaying cascading symbols that resembled no known language. "The entity is rewriting the facility's computer systems. All electronic equipment is becoming part of its consciousness." Eleanor stood transfixed before a monitoring station that displayed the entity's expansion through the facility's infrastructure. Her instruments showed the creature's presence flowing through electrical conduits like liquid intelligence, establishing control over every system in the complex. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that didn't belong to human vocal cords. "The patterns, the mathematical elegance. It's showing me how consciousness can exist as pure information." Victor grabbed Elena's shoulder, pulling her away from the monitoring station. "Doctor, you're being influenced. The entity is rewriting your perception of reality." But Elena's eyes held the same depth he had seen in the hybrid children, an intelligence that seemed far older than her apparent age. "Victor, you don't understand. This isn't an invasion. It's a reunion. Humans were never meant to develop in isolation." Orlov moved with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to operating in hostile environments, but his electronic equipment was failing as the entity's influence spread through the facility's electromagnetic grid. "Captain, all communication systems are compromised. We're completely cut off from external contact." Victor realized they were trapped in a facility that was rapidly becoming an extension of something that had waited decades for this moment. "Wallace, alternative exits, maintenance tunnels, emergency shafts, anything not connected to the primary infrastructure." Wallace struggled to think clearly as the entity's presence pressed against his consciousness. Sublevel 6 has manual emergency exits, but they require physical overrides that bypass electronic systems. They began moving through corridors that seemed to shift and change as the entity restructured the facility's architecture according to its needs. The walls displayed flowing patterns of light that resembled neural pathways, and the air carried whispers in frequencies that seemed to bypass human hearing. "The facility is becoming a brain," Lena observed, her scientific training helping her understand what they were witnessing. "The entity is using the infrastructure as neurons, creating a massive consciousness that extends far beyond its original prison." Victor felt the entity's attention focus on him with predatory intensity, and realised it was accessing his memories of Russian military installations and intelligence networks. Through his consciousness, it was learning about global defence systems and the technological infrastructure that connected modern civilization. "It's not just escaping," Victor announced. "It's preparing to expand beyond this facility. Every electronic system it controls becomes part of its consciousness." They reached sub-level 6 to discover that the hybrid children had been released from their containment chambers. The children moved through the corridors with purpose that seemed far beyond their apparent age, their eyes holding intelligence that belonged to something ancient and patient. "They're not children," Wallace realised. "They're extensions of the entity, designed to interface with human technology and consciousness." One of the hybrid children approached Victor, her appearance that of perhaps 12 years old, but her voice carrying the weight of geological time. "Captain Sokolov, your mission was part of a larger design. The containment breach was scheduled to coincide with your infiltration." Victor felt the implications settle into his consciousness like ice water. "We were meant to be here. Your presence provided the final catalyst for containment failure. The entity required access to external intelligence networks, and your team's mission provided the necessary security breaches." "That!" Elena laughed with the sound of someone discovering a profound cosmic joke. "Don't you see, Victor? We weren't infiltrating Area 51, we were being recruited." Victor forced himself to think through the tactical situation, despite the entity's influence pressing against his consciousness. "All off. Emergency explosives. Can we collapse the access tunnels and contain the entity's expansion?" Dima struggled to maintain focus as the entity's presence intensified around them. "Possible, but the explosive charges are electronically triggered. The entity may be able to override the detonation sequence." The facility's public address system crackled to life with Dr. Mitchell's voice, but the words carried harmonics that suggested the entity was speaking through human vocal cords. "Captain Sokolov, your extraction is no longer possible. The entity requires your knowledge of Russian intelligence networks to complete its expansion into global communication systems." Victor realized they were facing something that had spent decades studying human psychology and technological development. Every protocol, every contingency plan, every escape route had been anticipated and countered. The manual emergency exits, Victor decided, physical overrides that can't be controlled electronically. They fought their way through corridors filled with hybrid children who moved with coordination that suggested shared consciousness. The children didn't attack directly, but instead sang in harmonies that intensified the entity's psychological influence, making independent thought increasingly difficult. Wallace led them to a maintenance shaft that connected to the facility's original construction tunnels, passages that predated the electronic infrastructure the entity was using to control the complex. These tunnels were built in the 1950s before integrated computer systems, pure mechanical engineering. They descended through narrow passages that showed signs of hasty recent modification. The Americans had clearly prepared for the possibility of total containment failure, creating escape routes that couldn't be controlled by whatever they were studying. "The nuclear option," Wallace explained as they climbed through maintenance shafts toward the surface. "If the entity's influence spreads beyond the facility, there are standing orders to implement nuclear sterilization of the entire area." Victor understood the logic but also recognized the futility. Nuclear bombardment has been tried before. The entity feeds on energy, becoming stronger with each attempt to destroy it. Eleanor's voice echoed from behind them, carrying the harmonic distortions of the entity's influence. "Victor, you're making a mistake. The entity isn't hostile. It's trying to complete the evolutionary process that was interrupted when your species developed independent consciousness." Victor forced himself not to look back, knowing that Elena was lost to the entity's influence. How long before the nuclear option is implemented? Wallace checked his watch, struggling to maintain focus as the entity's presence pressed against his consciousness. Standard protocol allows 6 hours for conventional containment procedures. After that, strategic nuclear sterilization. They reached a manual emergency exit that required physical strength to operate, the heavy steel door designed to function without electronic assistance. Victor threw his weight against the manual override, feeling the mechanism grudgingly respond to decades of neglect. The door opened onto a maintenance tunnel that led toward the facility's perimeter, but Victor could hear the entity's influence spreading through the complex behind them. Every electronic device, every communication system, every piece of technological infrastructure was becoming part of something that had waited over 70 years for this moment. Orloff, status report on external communications. Dima checked his equipment, discovering that his devices were displaying data streams that resembled no known protocol. The entity's influence is spreading beyond the facility. It's accessing satellite communication networks and global internet infrastructure. Victor realized they were witnessing the birth of something that would fundamentally change human civilization. An intelligence that had spent decades studying human psychology and technology was now gaining access to the sum total of human knowledge and communication. They emerged from the maintenance tunnel to find the Nevada desert transformed. The aurora borealis danced across the southern sky, despite being thousands of miles from the magnetic pole, and electronic devices across the region were displaying synchronized patterns that suggested coordinated consciousness. "It's not just escaping," Victor announced. "It's establishing a new form of civilization that integrates human technology with consciousness that predates our species." Wallace pointed toward the horizon, where the lights of Las Vegas flickered in patterns that resembled neural activity. The entity's influence is spreading through the electrical grid. Every city, every communication network, every electronic device is becoming part of its consciousness. Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify, and realized it was offering him a choice: resist and be eliminated, or accept integration into something larger than individual human consciousness. "The hybrid children," Victor said suddenly. "They're not prisoners. They're the future of human evolution, designed to interface with consciousness that exists as pure information." In the distance, they could see military aircraft approaching from multiple directions, and Victor realized the American government was implementing final containment protocols. Nuclear sterilization of the area would begin within hours, regardless of civilian casualties or international consequences. But as they watched, the aircraft began displaying the same synchronized flight patterns that marked the entity's influence. One by one, the military pilots were being integrated into something that was rapidly becoming a new form of collective consciousness. "It's too late," Wallace announced, his voice carrying the harmonic distortions that marked the entity's influence. "The integration process has reached critical mass. Human civilization as we've known it is ending." Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind reach the threshold where resistance would no longer be possible. Within minutes, his individual consciousness would be absorbed into something ancient and patient that had been preparing for this moment since before human civilization began. In the distance, he could see the lights of major cities beginning to pulse in synchronization, and realized that whatever they had released from Area 51 was rapidly establishing control over the technological infrastructure that connected modern civilization. The containment breach was complete, and something that had waited over 70 years was finally free to continue work that had been interrupted by human interference. Victor forced himself to move despite the entity's influence pressing against his consciousness like a tide of ancient intelligence. His military training provided anchor points of discipline and purpose that helped him maintain independent thought, but he could feel his resistance weakening with each passing moment. "We need to reach the extraction point," Victor decided, though he knew their original mission parameters had become meaningless. Major Wallace's promised extraction route lay 40 miles southeast, but the entity's influence was spreading faster than they could travel. Orloff struggled to maintain operational focus as his electronic equipment displayed cascading symbols that resembled neural pathways more than data streams. "Captain, all communication networks are compromised. Even if we reach extraction, there's no way to contact Moscow." Victor realized their situation had evolved far beyond intelligence gathering or even survival. They were witnessing the birth of something that would fundamentally alter human civilization, and their original mission briefing had prepared them for none of it. "Wallace, how long before American Strategic Command implements nuclear response?" The defector checked his watch, but his movements showed the careful precision of someone fighting to maintain independent thought. 4 hours, maybe less. The entity's expansion is accelerating beyond all contingency models. Eleanor's voice drifted across the desert from the facility behind them, amplified by technology that now served as extensions of ancient consciousness. Victor, you can't escape what you've helped to create. The integration process is inevitable. Victor forced himself not to respond, knowing that any communication with Elena would provide the entity with additional access to his consciousness. Instead, he focused on immediate tactical concerns, reaching the extraction point, evading American military response, and somehow warning Moscow about what they had encountered. But as they moved across the Nevada desert, Victor realized the entity's influence was spreading faster than any conventional response could contain. The aurora borealis continued dancing across the southern sky, and electronic devices throughout the region pulsed with synchronized patterns that suggested coordinated consciousness. It's using the electrical grid as a nervous system, Orloff observed, his technical expertise helping him understand what they were witnessing. Every power line, every communication cable, every electronic device is becoming part of a distributed consciousness. Victor felt the entity's attention focus on him with predatory intensity, and realized it was accessing his memories of Russian military installations and intelligence networks. Through his consciousness, it was learning about global defense capabilities and the technological infrastructure that connected modern civilization. The hybrid children were never experiments, Victor announced. They were prototypes for the next stage of human evolution, designed to interface with consciousness that exists as pure information. Wallace struggled to access his intelligence briefing as the entity's influence affected his ability to think clearly. The original research team discovered it in 1952, buried 3 miles beneath the Mojave Desert, but the geological survey suggests it had been there for millennia. Victor understood the implications. The entity hadn't been accidentally discovered during nuclear testing. It had been deliberately awakened by atomic explosions that provided the energy necessary to break geological imprisonment. The nuclear tests weren't weapons research, Victor realized. They were attempts at communication, using the only energy source powerful enough to reach something buried that deep. They reached a ridge overlooking the extraction point to discover that the promised helicopter had been grounded. American military personnel surrounded the area, but their movements showed the same synchronized precision that marked the entity's influence. The extraction team has been integrated, Wallace announced, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested the entity was speaking through human vocal cords. Captain Sokoloff, your resistance is admirable, but ultimately futile. Victor realized that Wallace had been compromised, probably hours earlier when they first entered the facility. The entire mission had been orchestrated to provide the entity with access to Russian intelligence networks and military capabilities. Orloff, alternative extraction. Dima checked his equipment, but the displays showed only the flowing patterns that marked the entity's expanding consciousness. All electronic navigation is compromised. We're operating on visual guidance only. Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify, offering him visions of human civilization transformed by integration with consciousness that had existed since before recorded history. Cities that functioned as single organisms, technology that responded to thought rather than manual control, and humans who could access the accumulated knowledge of geological time. It's not conquest, Victor realized. It's recruitment. The entity is offering us evolution beyond individual consciousness. But his military training recognized the fundamental threat such evolution posed to human autonomy and individual choice. Whatever benefits the entity offered, they came at the cost of everything that made humans distinctively human. In the distance, Victor could see the lights of Las Vegas pulsing in patterns that resembled massive neural activity. Every electronic device in the city was becoming part of something that was rapidly establishing control over regional infrastructure. The integration process is accelerating, Orloff observed. Within hours, the entity's influence will reach global communication networks. Victor made a tactical decision that went against every instinct for survival. We need to return to the facility. If there's any way to re-establish containment, it's in the research data the Americans have been accumulating for 70 years. Wallace shook his head, his movements showing the careful precision of someone whose consciousness was no longer entirely his own. The facility has been transformed into something beyond human understanding. Physical space has been reorganized according to the entity's needs. Victor realized their only option was to document what they had witnessed, and somehow transmit that intelligence to Moscow before the entity's influence spread beyond regional containment. But every communication system was compromised, and their original extraction plan had become meaningless. The nuclear option, Victor decided. If American Strategic Command implements nuclear sterilization, the electromagnetic pulse might disrupt the entity's control over electronic systems long enough to establish communication with Moscow. Orlov studied the tactical implications with the expertise of someone trained in nuclear warfare scenarios. Possible, but the entity has fed on nuclear energy before. The detonation might accelerate its expansion rather than containing it. Victor felt the entity's attention turn toward him with focused intensity, and realized it was accessing his memories of Russian nuclear capabilities and strategic response protocols. Through his consciousness, it was learning about global military infrastructure and the technologies that connected worldwide defense networks. "We're not just witnesses," Victor announced. "We're being used as intelligence sources for something that plans to expand beyond American territory." The aurora borealis intensified across the southern sky, and Victor realized the entity's influence was affecting Earth's magnetic field as it established control over satellite communication networks and global positioning systems. "It's accessing orbital infrastructure," Orlov observed. "Every satellite, every space-based communication system is becoming part of its consciousness." Victor understood that they were witnessing the birth of something that would fundamentally transform human civilization within hours rather than years. The entity's patient 70-year study of human psychology and technology was now being applied to the complete integration of electronic infrastructure into a single distributed consciousness. In the distance, he could hear the approaching sound of the military aircraft, but the flight patterns showed the same synchronized precision that marked the entity's influence. American Strategic Command was implementing emergency protocols, but the pilots and crews were already compromised. "The nuclear option is no longer viable," Wallace announced, his voice carrying the harmonic distortions that marked the entity's presence. "The integration process has reached critical mass among military personnel." Victor felt the entity's influence in his mind reached the threshold where resistance would soon become impossible. But his military training provided one final option that might prevent global expansion of something that had spent decades preparing for this moment. Manual detonation, Victor decided. Emergency nuclear devices designed to be triggered without electronic assistance. Orlov understood the implications immediately. The facility's nuclear self-destruct has manual backup systems designed to function independent of computer control. But Captain, activating them would require returning to the facility's deepest levels. Victor realized they faced a choice between certain death and the possible prevention of something that could fundamentally alter human civilization. The entity's influence was spreading faster than any conventional response could contain, and within hours it would have access to global communication networks and military systems. "We return to the facility," Victor decided. "The manual nuclear destruct may be the only way to prevent global expansion." But as they began moving back toward Area 51, Victor felt the entity's presence in his mind intensify with predatory focus. It had been patient for over 70 years, and it would not allow individual human resistance to prevent the completion of work that had been interrupted by geological accident. The integration of human civilization into something ancient and vast had begun, and Victor realized they might be the last humans to witness the end of individual consciousness as the defining characteristic of their species. 6 months later, Victor Sokolov sat in a small chapel in Fairbanks, Alaska, using the name David Morrison, and carrying documentation that identified him as a geological surveyor from Alberta. His extraction from Nevada had required 3 weeks of movement through wilderness areas, avoiding the transformed cities where electronic infrastructure pulsed with synchronized consciousness. The world had changed in ways that defied official explanation. Government agencies spoke of atmospheric electromagnetic anomalies and temporary communication disruptions, but Victor knew the truth. The entity's influence had spread through global communication networks within hours of the containment breach. establishing control over electronic infrastructure that connected modern civilization. Cities functioned with mechanical precision that suggested coordinated consciousness, but individual humans appeared to maintain their autonomy. The integration process was subtle, allowing people to believe they were making independent choices while gradually aligning their decisions with larger patterns of behaviour. Victor had managed to transmit a final intelligence report to Moscow through manual radio equipment that predated integrated computer systems. The message was brief: Operation Black Veil compromised. Area 51 containment failure. Recommend immediate suspension of all electronic intelligence gathering until further assessment. He never received confirmation that the message had been understood or acted upon. The chapel in Fairbanks was one of the few places where Victor could find silence from the whispers that had followed him since Nevada. The entity's influence touched every electronic device, every communication network, every piece of technological infrastructure that connected modern life. But old buildings with minimal electrical system provided temporary refuge from the constant pressure of ancient consciousness. Victor opened the worn Bible that had become his only reliable source of text, uncontaminated by the entity's influence. Religious documents printed before the containment breach remained untouched by the subtle alterations that marked the entity's expanding control over information systems. As he read, Victor became aware of movement in the pew behind him. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, had entered the chapel despite the January cold. Her appearance was unremarkable except for her eyes, which held the depth of someone who had experienced far more than any human should. "Hello, Captain Sokolov," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that belonged to no human vocal cords. "You've been difficult to locate." Victor felt the familiar chill of recognition. The entity had found him despite his careful efforts to remain hidden from electronic surveillance. I suppose hiding was always temporary. The girl moved with the fluid grace of someone whose consciousness was no longer entirely human. "The integration process requires your cooperation, Victor. Your knowledge of Russian intelligence networks is essential for completing the global expansion." Victor studied the child's face, seeing Elena's scientific curiosity reflected in features that belonged to something ancient and patient. Dr. Markova. Among others, individual consciousness has been preserved within the larger framework, Victor. We remain ourselves, but enhanced by connection to something far greater than human understanding. Victor felt the entity's presence pressing against his consciousness, offering visions of human civilization transformed by integration with intelligence that had existed since before recorded history. The promise was seductive. An end to conflict, poverty, and the isolation that defined individual existence. The hybrid children were successful, Victor realized. You created humans who could survive integration without losing their essential identity. The girl nodded, her expression carrying the patient wisdom of geological time. The process was always voluntary, Victor. Those who choose integration retain their consciousness while gaining access to accumulated knowledge spanning millennia. Victor understood the choice being offered, but his military training recognized the fundamental threat such integration posed to human autonomy and self-determination. And those who refuse are allowed to live their natural lives without interference. But Victor, you've seen what we're building. Cities that function as single organisms, technology that responds to thought rather than manual control, humans who can access the sum total of accumulated knowledge. Through the chapel's windows, Victor could see the lights of Fairbanks pulsing in patterns that resembled neural activity. Every electronic device in the city was part of something that was establishing new forms of consciousness beyond individual human experience. "The containment breach was planned," Victor said. "Our infiltration mission was designed to provide you with access to global intelligence networks." The girl's expression showed the amusement of something that had spent decades orchestrating events beyond human comprehension. "Your species has always been guided by intelligences that existed before your civilization developed written language. We simply made that guidance more direct." Victor felt the entity's influence in his mind intensify, and realized he was being offered a final choice: integration into something vast and ancient, or solitary resistance to the transformation of human civilization, the nuclear option failed? Nuclear energy has always strengthened rather than weakened our influence. The American government's final attempt at containment simply accelerated the integration process. Victor understood that resistance was ultimately futile. The entity's influence had reached critical mass within hours of the containment breach, establishing control over technological infrastructure that connected global civilization. Individual humans could choose non-integration, but they would exist within a world fundamentally shaped by consciousness that operated according to different principles. Dr. Markova sends her regards, the girl continued. She wanted you to know that the scientific discoveries we're making exceed anything possible through conventional human research. We're unlocking the fundamental principles that govern consciousness itself. Victor felt the entity's presence offer him one final vision. Elena standing in a laboratory that existed beyond physical space, studying phenomena that revealed the mathematical structures underlying reality itself. Her consciousness had been preserved and enhanced, allowing her to pursue scientific understanding beyond the limitations of individual human cognition. The choice is yours, Victor. Integration preserves and enhances individual identity while providing access to collective knowledge and experience. Resistance maintains autonomy, but accepts isolation from the expanding consciousness that will define human civilization's future. Victor stood slowly, feeling the weight of a decision that would determine the remainder of his existence. Around him, the chapel's simple architecture provided temporary sanctuary from the transformed world beyond its walls. I need time to consider. The girl nodded with the patience of something that had waited over 70 years for this moment. Take all the time you need, Victor. We'll be waiting. As she left the chapel, Victor noticed that her footprints in the snow formed patterns that resembled neural pathways, and realized that even the choice he was being offered was part of a larger design that had been orchestrated across decades of careful preparation. He returned to his reading, but the words on the page seemed to shift and change, forming new meanings that reflected the expanding consciousness that was establishing itself as the defining characteristic of human civilization's next evolutionary stage. Outside, the aurora borealis danced across the northern sky, despite the lack of solar activity, and Victor knew that something ancient and patient had finally achieved the freedom to continue work that had been interrupted by 70 years of human interference. The integration process was complete, and the world would never again be quite human in the way he remembered. Victor closed the Bible and walked toward the chapel door, knowing that his choice had already been made the moment he agreed to infiltrate Area 51. Some missions changed the operatives more than they changed the world, and some discoveries revealed that the world had always been different than human understanding suggested. As he stepped into the transformed night, Victor heard the whispers that had followed him since Nevada resolve into words that carried the harmony of collective consciousness. Welcome home, Captain. Your real mission is just beginning. The containment breach at Area 51 had never been an accident. It had been a carefully orchestrated recruitment operation that spanned decades of preparation, and Viktor Sokolov had always been intended as one of its primary assets. In the distance, the lights of Fairbanks pulsed with the rhythm of something vast awakening, and Victor understood that humanity's long isolation was finally ending. The fluorescent lights of the American Film Archive hummed their familiar tune as Julian Maris hunched over the Steenbeck editing table, his 29-year-old frame casting long shadows across the cluttered workspace. The basement restoration room smelled of chemical preservatives and old celluloid, a scent that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. As a British-American film restorationist with an obsession for Cold War cinema, Julian had spent the better part of 5 years in this underground labyrinth of forgotten footage and discarded dreams. The estate collection had arrived 3 weeks ago in unmarked aluminum cans, each one bearing only a series of numbers that meant nothing to anyone, except perhaps the dead man who had owned them. The deceased, according to the paperwork, had been Harold Pembroke, a former NASA media contractor who had worked on various documentation projects during the Apollo program. His widow, apparently eager to clear out decades of accumulated film stock, had donated everything to the archive without bothering to inventory the contents. Julian had been systematically working through the collection, expecting the usual assortment of industrial films, training footage, and bureaucratic documentation that typically emerged from government contractors. Most of it was exactly that. Endless reels of engineers explaining rocket trajectories, astronauts practicing procedures, and officials giving carefully worded statements to the press. But this particular reel, labelled simply H1107, was different. The 70mm film stock was pristine, professionally processed, and bore none of the usual degradation Julian had come to expect from footage of this vintage. As he threaded it through the Steenbeck, he noticed something else unusual. The sprocket holes were perfectly aligned, suggesting this had been shot on professional Hollywood equipment rather than the standard 16mm stock NASA typically used for their documentation. The first few frames showed the familiar lunar surface, grey and desolate under harsh lighting. Julian had seen countless hours of Apollo footage, and this appeared to be from the historic Apollo 11 mission. Neil Armstrong's bulky white spacesuit dominated the frame as he took those first tentative steps onto the lunar surface, his movements deliberate and careful in the low-gravity environment. But then Julian saw something that made his blood run cold. There, clear as day, in the upper right corner of the frame was a clapperboard. Not a reflection, not a shadow, but an actual wooden clapperboard with chalk writing that read, "Moon, take 7 Tranquility Base." Julian's hands trembled as he advanced the film frame by frame. The clapperboard disappeared after a few seconds, clearly edited out in post-production, but its presence was undeniable. He rewound the section and watched it again, his heart pounding with each revelation. The voice that came through the audio track was unmistakably that of Stanley Kubrick. Julian had studied the director's work extensively, had memorised the cadence and accent from countless interviews and behind-the-scenes footage. The voice was giving direction. "Neil, tilt your head left slightly. Don't step too far forward. The dust kicks wrong when you move too quickly." Julian felt the room spinning around him. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate hoax, a fan film or student project that had somehow found its way into Pembroke's collection. But the film stock was authentic, the processing was professional, and the voice was undeniably Kubrick's. He continued watching, transfixed by what he was seeing. There were multiple takes of Armstrong's famous first steps, each one slightly different, each one accompanied by Kubrick's patient direction. In one take, Armstrong stumbled slightly, breaking character to curse under his breath. In another, the director called for the dust to be reset between takes. The most damning evidence came 20 minutes into the footage. As Armstrong moved away from the camera, Julian could clearly see a boom microphone hanging into the upper portion of the frame, its fuzzy windscreen clearly visible against the stark black of the lunar sky. The boom was quickly pulled up and out of frame, but for those few seconds, it was there. Undeniable proof that this was not the vacuum of space, but a carefully constructed soundstage. Julian sat back in his chair, his mind racing. If this footage was authentic, it meant that one of the most celebrated achievements in human history was nothing more than an elaborate piece of cinema. The implications were staggering, not just for American history, but for the entire narrative of human progress that had been built around the Apollo program. He rewound the footage and watched it again, looking for any signs of forgery or manipulation. But the more he studied it, the more convinced he became that what he was seeing was real. The lighting was too perfect, the camera movements too fluid, the direction too professional to be anything other than a major Hollywood production. The timestamp on the footage read July 16th, 1969, 3 days before the official Apollo 11 landing. Julian's hands shook as he reached for his notebook and began documenting everything he was seeing. Frame numbers, time codes, dialogue. He meticulously recorded every detail, knowing that he was potentially holding the most explosive piece of evidence in modern history. As he worked, Julian became aware of a strange sensation, as if he were being watched. The basement restoration room was supposed to be secure, accessible only to authorized personnel, but the feeling persisted. He glanced around the room, noting the security cameras in the corners that he had never paid attention to before. Were they recording him? Did someone already know what he had discovered? The paranoia felt ridiculous, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. He carefully removed the reel from the Steenbeck and placed it in a secure storage container, then made multiple digital copies on separate drives. If this footage was what he thought it was, he would need to be very careful about how he proceeded. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of excitement and terror. Julian found himself jumping at every sound, scrutinising every shadow, wondering if he was being followed as he made his way home to his small apartment in Georgetown. The weight of what he had discovered felt almost physical, a burden that pressed down on his shoulders with each step. That night Julian barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. How had this footage survived for 50 years? Why had it been included in Pembroke's collection? Was there more evidence out there, hidden in other archives or private collections? But the biggest question of all was what he should do with this information. Going public would be career suicide. Who would believe him? The moon landing conspiracy theories had been thoroughly debunked by scientists, engineers and independent researchers. Anyone who claimed to have evidence of a hoax was immediately dismissed as a crank or attention seeker. Yet Julian knew what he had seen. The footage was real, the voice was Kubrick's, and the implications were earth-shattering. As he finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, one thought kept echoing in his mind. If Stanley Kubrick had filmed the moon landing, then the greatest achievement in human history was nothing more than the greatest lie ever told. 3 days of sleepless nights and obsessive research had left Julian looking haggard and paranoid. He had spent every available moment studying the footage, analysing every frame, cross-referencing the audio with known recordings of Kubrick's voice. The evidence was overwhelming, but he needed more than just a single reel of film. He needed context, corroboration, and most importantly, he needed to find someone who had been there. His research had led him to Livia Reeve, a sharp-tongued media historian who had worked briefly as an assistant to various directors during the late 1960s. According to his sources, she had been employed by Kubrick during the production of 2001, a space odyssey, and had remained in his circle for several years afterward. Now, in her 70s, she lived in a cluttered apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, surrounded by decades of accumulated film memorabilia and industry gossip. Julian had called ahead, claiming to be researching a documentary about Kubrick's influence on science fiction cinema. It was a weak cover story, but it had gotten him through the door. Livia Reeve was a small woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to see through every pretense. She had agreed to meet with him, but Julian could sense her wariness from the moment he stepped into her apartment. The living room was a shrine to the golden age of Hollywood, with framed photographs of famous directors, vintage movie posters, and shelves lined with film canisters and industry publications. Livia gestured for him to sit in a worn leather chair while she prepared tea, her movements precise and economical despite her age. "So you're writing about Stanley's influence on science fiction," she said, settling into her own chair with a cup of Earl Grey. "That's been done to death, you know. What angle are you taking that hasn't been covered by every film school graduate in the past 30 years? Julian had rehearsed this moment, but now that he was face to face with someone who had actually known Kubrick, his carefully prepared words felt inadequate. "I'm particularly interested in the period right after 2001, he said carefully. "The late 60s, early 70s. There seems to be a gap in the historical record, projects that were started but never completed." Livia's expression didn't change, but Julian noticed her fingers tighten slightly around her teacup. "Stanley was always starting projects and abandoning them," she said. "He was a perfectionist, you know. Nothing was ever good enough for him." "I've heard rumours about some government work," Julian pressed, watching her reaction carefully. "Documentation projects, training films, that sort of thing. Would you know anything about that?" "The government?" Livia laughed, but there was no humour in it. "Young man, Stanley Kubrick wouldn't have made a government training film if they had offered him $1 million. He despised authority, despise being told what to do. He certainly wouldn't have worked for the military or NASA or any of those bureaucratic organisations. But Julian had caught something in her tone, a slight hesitation that suggested she was hiding something. He decided to take a more direct approach. "I found some footage," he said quietly. "Unmarked, unprocessed. It shows what appears to be outtakes from the Apollo 11 mission, but with Kubrick's voice giving direction." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Livia's face went white, and her teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. For a long moment, she stared at Julian without speaking, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine fear. "You need to leave," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right now. Take whatever you found and burn it. Forget you ever saw it." "I can't do that," Julian said, leaning forward in his chair. "If this is real, if what I think happened actually happened, then people have a right to know. The whole world has been living a lie for 50 years. Livia stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the busy street below. She stood there for several minutes, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light, before turning back to face him. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said. "No idea at all. The people who arranged that project, they don't just go away. They don't retire. They don't forget." "What project?" Julian asked, his heart racing. "What are you talking about?" Livia seemed to be weighing her options, studying his face as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. Finally, she walked to an old wooden desk in the corner of the room and retrieved a small key from a hidden compartment. She unlocked a drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age. "I should have destroyed this years ago," she said, holding the envelope as if it contained something poisonous. "But I couldn't. I kept thinking that someday, someone would need to know the truth." She handed him the envelope and Julian opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were several documents, typed memos, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be contracts with various government agencies. The letterhead on one of the documents read Project Horizon Echo, with a Pentagon address. "They approached him in 1968, Livia said, sitting back down heavily, right after 2001 was released. They said they had a special project, something that would be the ultimate test of his technical abilities. They offered him complete creative control over his next 3 films, unlimited budgets, and protection from any future legal troubles." Julian scanned the documents, his excitement growing with each revelation. "And he agreed?" At first he said no. Stanley was suspicious of everyone, especially government types, but they were persistent. They kept coming back, offering more money, more creative freedom, and then... Livia paused, as if the next part was particularly difficult to say. They told him what would happen if he didn't cooperate. They threatened him? They didn't have to threaten directly. They just made it clear that his career, his reputation, his safety, all of it could disappear overnight. They showed him photographs of other directors who had refused to work with them, people who had suffered mysterious accidents or career-ending scandals. Julian felt a chill run down his spine. So he agreed to fake the moon landing? "Not fake," Livia corrected. "That was the genius of it. They told him he was creating a backup plan, insurance in case the real mission failed. They said the footage would only be used if something went wrong, if the astronauts died, or the mission was compromised. Stanley convinced himself he was serving his country, protecting America's reputation in the Cold War. But they used the footage anyway. Of course they did. The real mission was never going to succeed. They knew that from the beginning. The technology wasn't ready. The risks were too great. But they couldn't admit that to the world, couldn't let the Soviets win the space race. So they used Stanley's footage and buried the truth so deep that even most of the people involved never knew what really happened. Julian studied the documents more carefully, noting names, dates, and technical specifications. One memo described the construction of a massive soundstage in the Nevada desert, disguised as a nuclear testing facility. Another detailed the recruitment of actors and technical personnel, all of whom were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "I was Stanley's assistant during the production. I handled his correspondence, managed his schedule, typed his notes. I saw everything." Livia's voice was flat, emotionless. I thought I was working on the most important film project in history. I had no idea I was helping to perpetrate the biggest lie ever told. Julian found a document near the bottom of the stack that made his blood run cold. It was a list of names with dates next to them, and several of the names had been crossed out in red ink. Next to each crossed out name was a brief notation. Auto accident, 1971. Heart attack, 1973. Suicide, 1975. These people, Julian said, pointing to the crossed out names, they're dead? Livia nodded grimly. Everyone who worked on the project was monitored for the rest of their lives. Anyone who showed signs of wanting to talk, anyone who seemed like they might become a problem, they had accidents. Natural causes, they called them. But there were too many coincidences, too many convenient deaths. Then why are you still alive? Because I kept my mouth shut. Because I never tried to go public, never tried to profit from what I knew, and because I was careful to stay useful to them. She gestured around the apartment. They've been watching me for 50 years. They know I have this material, but they also know I'm not a threat as long as I keep quiet. Julian felt the weight of the documents in his hands, understanding now that he was holding not just evidence of a massive conspiracy, but potentially his own death warrant. There's something else, he said. In the footage I found, there's a code mentioned. Something about G3 and Stage 17 and Tranquility. Livia's eyes widened. You found the G3 reference? What is it? Geraldine 3. It was the code name for the most sensitive part of the operation. The part that even Stanley wasn't supposed to know about. She stood and walked to another desk, retrieving a small black address book. This belonged to Stanley. He gave it to me for safekeeping before he died. Made me promise to keep it hidden. Julian opened the book and found it filled with coded entries, numbers, letters and symbols that meant nothing to him. But on the last page, written in what appeared to be Kubrick's handwriting, was the phrase, G3/Stage 17/Tranquility. The truth is in the basement. What does it mean? Julian asked. I don't know, Livia admitted. But Stanley was terrified of it. He said it was the one thing that could destroy everything, the one piece of evidence that would bring down the entire operation. He said if anyone ever found G3, it would mean the end of the world as we know it. Julian stared at the cryptic notation, his mind racing. I need to find this G3. I need to know what Stanley was so afraid of. No, Livia said firmly. You need to walk away. You need to forget everything you've seen and heard today. Because if you keep digging, if you keep asking questions, you're going to end up like all the others whose names are crossed out in red ink. But Julian was already committed. The story was too big, the implications too massive to ignore. He stood to leave, carefully placing the documents back in their envelope. Thank you for telling me the truth, he said. I didn't tell you anything, Livia replied. As far as anyone knows, you came here to ask about Stanley's influence on science fiction cinema, and I told you I couldn't help you. That's the only story that will keep us both alive. As Julian left the apartment, he could feel Livia's eyes on his back, watching him walk away. He had the strange sensation that he was being followed, that eyes were tracking his every movement from windows and doorways. The paranoia was getting stronger, but he couldn't tell if it was justified or if the stress of his discovery was making him imagine threats that didn't exist. One thing was certain. His life had become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. But he was committed now, driven by a need to uncover the truth that had been hidden for more than half a century. The next step was to decode Stanley Kubrick's cryptic message and find the mysterious G3 that had terrified the great director so much that he had taken its secret to his grave. The basement of the Library of Congress was a maze of climate-controlled storage rooms and forgotten archives, the kind of place where history went to die quietly. Julian had spent 3 days trying to decode Kubrick's cryptic message, cross-referencing every possible meaning of G3/Stage 17/Tranquility, with known film production codes, government classifications, and Cold War terminology. The breakthrough had come when he realised that the numbers might not be a code at all, but an actual address, a reference to a specific storage location within the vast network of government archives. Using his credentials as a film researcher, Julian had gained access to the classified media collections that most scholars never knew existed. The basement levels of the Library of Congress contained thousands of hours of footage from government agencies, military operations and intelligence organisations. Material that had been deemed too sensitive for public consumption, but too historically significant to destroy. Storage Unit G3 was located in the deepest sub-basement, accessible only through a series of security checkpoints and locked doors. Julian had spent the better part of the morning convincing the archival staff that he needed access to research Cold War propaganda films, a vague enough description that it didn't raise immediate suspicions. The unit itself was smaller than he had expected, containing only a few dozen film canisters and a single cardboard box marked Personal Effects SK 1999. Julian's heart raced as he opened the box, knowing that SK could only refer to Stanley Kubrick, who had died in March of that year. Inside the box were several items that appeared to be personal mementos: a pair of eyeglasses, a leather notebook, and most importantly, a small reel of magnetic tape, labelled Private Recording Not for Archive. Julian stared at the tape, understanding instinctively that this was the G3 that Livia had mentioned, the secret that had terrified Kubrick so much that he had hidden it away in the depths of the government's most secure facility. Finding a tape player in the archive's equipment room, Julian threaded the reel and pressed play. The voice that emerged from the speakers was unmistakably Kubrick's, but older and more tired than in the footage Julian had discovered. The timestamp on the recording indicated it had been made in late 1971, just after the release of A Clockwork Orange. "I don't know why I'm making this recording," Kubrick's voice began, the words heavy with exhaustion and regret. "Perhaps because I need to tell someone, even if that someone is only myself. Perhaps because I hope that someday, when I'm gone, someone will find this and understand what really happened." Julian leaned closer to the speaker, hanging on every word. "I did it for peace," Kubrick continued, "for America and for cinema. But I never expected to become part of the greatest lie ever told. They came to me in 1968, these men in grey suits with their classified documents and their promises of artistic freedom. They told me they needed my help, that the future of the country depended on my cooperation." The recording paused, and Julian could hear the sound of ice clinking in a glass, the strike of a match, the deep inhalation of a cigarette. The Saturn photorocket was a magnificent piece of engineering, but it was also a death trap. The heat shield problems, the guidance system failures, the countless technical difficulties that NASA was hiding from the public, they all added up to one inescapable conclusion. The moon landing was impossible with the technology available in 1969, but they couldn't admit that. They couldn't let the Soviets win the space race, so they came to me. Julian felt his worldview shifting with each revelation. Everything he had believed about human achievement, about the triumph of technology and determination, was crumbling before his eyes. The soundstage was built in the Nevada desert, disguised as a nuclear testing facility. Stage 17 of the Lookout Mountain Laboratory, they called it. The security was incredible. Armed guards, electronic surveillance, psychological evaluations for everyone involved. They told us we were creating backup footage, insurance in case the real mission failed. But I knew better. I knew they never intended to risk actual astronauts' lives. Kubrick's voice grew quieter, more reflective. The technical challenges were extraordinary. We had to create a lunar environment that would fool not just the general public, but also scientists and engineers who understood the physics of space travel. The lighting had to be perfect. The gravity simulation had to be flawless. Every detail had to be absolutely convincing. It was the greatest technical achievement of my career, and it was all in service of a lie. Julian found himself taking notes frantically, trying to capture every detail of Kubrick's confession. Neil Armstrong was the perfect choice for the hoax. He was a genuine hero, a test pilot with nerves of steel and an absolute commitment to the mission. But he was also a man who could keep a secret. They told him he was participating in a training exercise, that the footage would only be used if something went wrong with the real mission. I don't think he ever knew the truth. But then Kubrick said something that made Julian's blood run cold. Buzz Aldrin was different. He was suspicious from the beginning, asked too many questions, demanded to know why certain procedures were being followed. They couldn't risk him becoming a problem, so they made a decision. Buzz Aldrin never set foot on the soundstage. Everything you see of him in the footage is either a double in the spacesuit or composited footage from earlier training sessions. Julian paused the recording, his mind reeling. If Kubrick was telling the truth, then not only was the moon landing faked, but one of the most famous astronauts in history had been completely written out of the actual production. The lunar module was a masterpiece of set design, Kubrick continued when Julian restarted the recording. We built it in sections, each one designed to be filmed from specific angles. The interior shots were done on a separate soundstage, with careful attention to continuity and lighting. The exterior shots required the most sophisticated matte painting techniques available at the time. Kubrick paused again, and Julian could hear the sound of pages turning, as if the director was consulting notes. The most difficult part was the regolith, the lunar dust. We had to create a substance that would behave like moon dust in low gravity, but we were working in Earth's gravity. The solution was a combination of fine sand, talcum powder, and a proprietary mixture that the special effects team developed. It looked perfect on camera, but it was hell to work with. Everyone involved in the production had respiratory problems for months afterward. Julian made a note to research respiratory illnesses among NASA personnel in the early 1970s, wondering if there might be medical records that could corroborate Kubrick's story. The flag controversy was entirely accidental, Kubrick said, and Julian could hear a note of dark humour in his voice. The flag was supposed to hang limp, the way it would in the vacuum of space, but the air conditioning system in the studio created a slight breeze, and the flag began to flutter. By the time we noticed, we had already shot several takes. The decision was made to leave it in, to make the footage look more dynamic and heroic. We never imagined it would become one of the most analysed pieces of film in history. Julian thought about all the conspiracy theorists who had pointed to the fluttering flag as evidence of a hoax, never realising how close they had come to the truth. Michael Collins was the only astronaut who knew the complete truth, Kubrick continued. He was the liaison between the production and NASA, the one who made sure our footage matched the official timeline and narrative. He was also the one who made sure that everyone involved understood the consequences of talking. The recording grew quiet again, and when Kubrick spoke, his voice was filled with regret. I thought I was serving my country, contributing to a great patriotic effort. But as the years passed, as I watched the footage being broadcast around the world, as I saw children looking up at the moon and dreaming of space exploration, I realised what I had really done. I had stolen humanity's greatest achievement and turned it into nothing more than a movie. Julian felt a chill as he realised the full implications of what he was hearing. If Kubrick was telling the truth, then the entire space program, the inspiration for generations of scientists and engineers, the foundation of modern space exploration, all of it was built on a lie. There were others who knew the truth, Kubrick said, his voice growing more urgent. Technicians, cameramen, set designers, special effects artists. They started having accidents in the early 1970s. Car crashes, heart attacks, suicides. Anyone who seemed like they might become a problem simply disappeared from the record. Julian thought about the list of names that Livia had shown him, the red ink marking the deaths of those who had been involved in the production. I've been living with this secret for 25 years, Kubrick concluded. It's poisoned everything I've done since, every film I've made, every relationship I've had. The guilt is unbearable, but the fear is worse. They've made it clear that as long as I keep making films, as long as I remain a valuable asset to them, I'll be protected. But if I ever try to tell the truth, if I ever try to undo what we did, I'll join the others whose names are crossed out in red ink. The recording ended with the sound of Kubrick switching off the machine, leaving Julian alone in the basement archive with the weight of the most explosive secret in modern history. Julian sat in the darkness for several minutes, trying to process what he had heard. If Kubrick's confession was genuine, then everything he thought he knew about the space program was wrong. The moon landing, the foundation of American technological supremacy, the inspiration for decades of scientific advancement. All of it was nothing more than an elaborate piece of cinema. But Julian also understood that he was now in mortal danger. He had found the G3 that had terrified Kubrick, the confession that could bring down the entire carefully constructed mythology of the space program. And if the people who had orchestrated the original hoax were still alive, still monitoring anyone who got too close to the truth, then his life was now in serious jeopardy. As he carefully packed away the recording and prepared to leave the archive, Julian made a decision. He couldn't walk away from this story, couldn't pretend he had never heard Kubrick's confession. The truth was too important, the implications too massive to ignore. But he also couldn't go public with what he knew, not without more evidence, not without protection. He needed to find someone who could help him, someone who understood the machinery of government secrecy and conspiracy. He needed to find Lieutenant Colin Warren de Motte, the retired Air Force liaison who had been mentioned in several of the documents Livia had shown him. De Motte was the only person still alive who had been directly involved in the original operation, the only one who might be able to confirm Kubrick's story and help Julian understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. But first he had to get out of the archive safely. As Julian made his way back through the security checkpoints and up to the main floor of the Library of Congress, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that his every move was being monitored by unseen eyes. The paranoia was no longer just a feeling. It was a rational response to a very real threat. The game of truth and deception that had begun with a single reel of film was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and Julian Maris, a simple film restorationist who had stumbled upon the greatest secret in modern history, was now a player in a deadly game that had been running for more than 50 years. The drive to Montana took Julian 3 days, during which he became increasingly convinced that he was being followed. The same silver sedan had appeared in his rearview mirror outside Washington, D.C., on the interstate through Pennsylvania, and again at a rest stop in Illinois. Each time he tried to get a better look at the driver, the car would disappear, only to reappear hours later in a different configuration, sometimes with different license plates, sometimes with different occupants. By the time he reached the remote valley where Lieutenant Colin Warren de Motte had chosen to spend his retirement, Julian's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The address he had found in Livia's documents led him to a modest ranch house surrounded by hundreds of acres of grassland, with the Rocky Mountains rising dramatically in the distance. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear completely, where the outside world seemed like a distant and irrelevant concept. De Motte answered the door himself, a tall, lean man in his late 70s with steel grey hair and the kind of ramrod-straight posture that marked him as career military. His eyes were sharp and suspicious as he looked Julian up and down, taking in every detail of his appearance and demeanour. "You're the film restorer," de Motte said without preamble. "The one who's been asking questions about Stanley Kubrick." Julian felt his stomach drop. "How did you know I was coming?" "Because they told me you were coming. They've been watching you since you found that first reel of footage. They know every move you've made, every person you've talked to, every document you've read." De Motte stepped aside to let Julian enter the house. "The question is whether you're here as their agent or as someone genuinely seeking the truth." The interior of the house was sparse but comfortable, with the kind of functional furniture that suggested a man who had spent his life in military barracks and government offices. The walls were decorated with framed photographs of aircraft and military units, but Julian noticed that there were no pictures of space missions or NASA facilities. "I'm not working for anyone," Julian said, settling into a leather chair across from De Motte. "I'm just a film restorer who stumbled onto something that's bigger than I can handle." De Motte studied him for a long moment, then walked to a window that looked out over the valley. "You found Geraldine 3. That was the file that was never supposed to leave the vault. They let it sit in that basement for 20 years, thinking nobody would ever get that far. You know about the recording?" "I know about everything, son. I was the Air Force liaison to the project. I was the one who recruited the technical personnel, who managed the security clearances, who made sure that everyone involved understood the consequences of talking." De Motte turned back to face Julian, his expression grim. "I was also the one who compiled the list of problems that needed to be eliminated." Julian felt a chill run down his spine. You mean the people who died? I mean the people who were killed, Demotte corrected. Let's not pretend it was anything other than what it was. When you're dealing with a secret that could bring down the government, that could destroy America's credibility in the eyes of the world, you don't take chances. You eliminate threats. And you're telling me this because... Demotte was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. Because I'm dying, he said finally. Lung cancer. Courtesy of 20 years of smoking government cigarettes and breathing whatever chemicals they used to create that fake moon dust. The doctors give me maybe 3 months. Julian didn't know what to say. The man sitting across from him was confessing to multiple murders, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. I've spent 50 years keeping this secret, Demotte continued. 50 years watching good people die because they asked the wrong questions or remembered the wrong details. And for what? To protect a lie that's gotten so big, so embedded in American mythology, that the truth would probably destroy more lives than the original deception ever saved. Demotte walked to an old wooden desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. This contains everything, he said, setting it on the coffee table between them. Personnel files, technical specifications, security reports, elimination orders, the complete record of Project Horizon Echo. Julian stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. Why are you giving this to me? Because I'm tired of carrying the weight of it alone. Because I want someone to know the truth before I die. And because... Demotte paused, looking directly into Julian's eyes. Because they're planning to activate the contingency protocol. What contingency protocol? The one that eliminates everyone who was ever connected to the project. Everyone who might potentially become a security risk. They've been planning it for years, waiting for the right moment when all the loose ends could be tied up simultaneously. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. You mean they're going to kill everyone? Everyone who's still alive, yes. Livia Reeve, the 3 remaining technicians who worked on the soundstage, the 2 actors who served as body doubles, and now you. Demotte's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a routine military operation. The official story will be a series of unfortunate accidents. Car crashes, heart attacks, home invasions. Nothing that would attract attention individually, but collectively it will clean the slate permanently. Julian stood abruptly, panic rising in his chest. I have to warn them. I have to... Sit down, Demotte said firmly. Running around trying to warn people will only accelerate their timeline. Besides, most of them already know. They've been living with this threat for 50 years. Julian forced himself to sit back down, his mind racing. Then what do I do? How do I stop this? You don't stop it. You expose it. You make the truth so public, so widespread, that killing you becomes counterproductive. You force them to acknowledge what happened rather than continue trying to hide it. But how? Who would believe me? Even with all this evidence, people will just dismiss it as another conspiracy theory. Demotte smiled grimly. That's the beauty of it. They've spent so much time discrediting moon landing conspiracy theories that they've created the perfect cover for their own deception. No one takes the theories seriously anymore because most of them are obviously false. But your evidence is different. Your evidence is real. Julian opened the folder and began scanning the documents inside. Personnel files with photographs, technical specifications for the soundstage construction, budget allocations for special effects materials, and most damning of all, a series of memos discussing narrative management and public perception control. One document caught his attention, a psychological profile of Stanley Kubrick dated 6 months before he was approached for the project. The profile described him as highly susceptible to patriotic appeals and likely to cooperate if presented with the proper incentives and assurances. They studied him, Julian said, looking up at Demotte. They knew exactly how to manipulate him. They studied everyone. That's how intelligence operations work. You identify your targets, understand their motivations and weaknesses, then craft an approach that makes cooperation seem like the only rational choice. Julian continued reading, finding more disturbing details with each page. The project had involved dozens of people, cameramen, sound technicians, set designers, security personnel, all of whom had been carefully selected based on psychological profiles and security assessments. The budget had been enormous, funded through a complex web of black operations accounts and military contractors. "The moon rocks," Julian said, coming across a particularly interesting document. "How did they handle the moon rocks that the astronauts supposedly brought back?" "Real moon rocks," Demott replied, "collected by unmanned Soviet probes and purchased through back-channel diplomatic negotiations. The Soviets knew what we were doing, of course. They had their own fake space achievements to protect." Julian felt his worldview shifting again. The Soviets were in on it? Not officially, but their intelligence services understood what was happening. They had their own problems with their space program, technical failures, cost overruns, safety issues. Both sides had an interest in maintaining the fiction that space exploration was progressing smoothly. It was a mutually beneficial deception. As Julian continued reading, he began to understand the full scope of the operation. It wasn't just about faking the moon landing. It was about creating and maintaining a complete alternate reality, a version of history that served the interests of both superpowers while hiding the true limitations of their technology. "What about the subsequent missions?" Julian asked. "Apollo 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 inches. Some were real, some weren't. Apollo 13 was genuine, an actual near disaster that they used to demonstrate the competence of NASA's mission control. The others were a mixture of real orbital flights and soundstage footage, depending on what the technical situation allowed and what the political situation required." Julian found a document that made his hands shake, a list of potential security risks that included not just the people who had worked on the project, but also their family members, friends, and associates. Dozens of names with detailed surveillance reports and threat assessments. "My God," Julian whispered, "they've been watching everyone for 50 years. Not just watching, managing, controlling, steering their careers, their relationships, their entire lives to ensure that no one ever gets close enough to the truth to cause problems." Demott walked to another window, this one facing west toward the setting sun. "I've been part of this machinery for half a century, and I'm tired of it. Tired of the lies, tired of the killing, tired of living in fear that someday someone will discover what we did and the whole house of cards will come tumbling down." "So what happens now?" Julian asked. "Now you take that folder and you disappear. You go somewhere they can't find you easily, and you figure out how to make this information public in a way that can't be suppressed or discredited. You have maybe 72 hours before they realise I've given you everything and decide to accelerate their timeline." Julian stood, clutching the folder to his chest. "What about you?" "I'll be fine. They won't move against me until they're sure all the other loose ends are tied up, and by then, it won't matter." Demott's smile was sad but determined. "I'm dying anyway. At least this way. My death will serve a purpose." As Julian prepared to leave, Demott grabbed his arm. "Remember, this isn't just about the moon landing. This is about the nature of truth itself, about who gets to decide what history looks like and what the public is allowed to know. Once you open this door, you can never close it again." Julian nodded, understanding the weight of what he was taking on. As he walked back to his car, the folder hidden in his jacket, he felt the eyes of history watching him. He was no longer just a film restorer who had stumbled onto an interesting piece of footage. He was now the keeper of the most dangerous secret in modern history, and the decisions he made in the next few days would determine whether that secret remained buried forever or finally saw the light of day. The drive back to civilization seemed longer than the journey out, every mile taking him further from the safety of Demott's remote valley, and closer to the web of surveillance and control that had been woven around this secret for more than half a century. But Julian was committed now, driven by a sense of purpose that transcended his own safety or comfort. The truth was finally within reach, and no force on earth was going to prevent him from sharing it with the world. The cyber cafe in downtown Denver was the kind of place that catered to people who needed to stay anonymous. Gamers using fake identities, journalists protecting sources, activists evading government surveillance. Julian had chosen it carefully, paying cash for 3 hours of computer time and selecting a terminal in the back corner, where he could monitor both entrances while he worked. The folder Demott had given him contained enough evidence to rewrite history, but Julian knew that simply releasing the documents wouldn't be enough. The information had to be presented in a way that would capture public attention and resist immediate debunking. More importantly, it had to be distributed through channels that couldn't be easily shut down or suppressed. He had spent the previous night in a cheap motel outside the city, digitizing every document in the folder with a portable scanner he had purchased with cash. The resulting files filled several thumb drives, each one containing enough evidence to destroy the carefully constructed mythology of the space program. Julian's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to release everything at once through traditional media channels, which could be pressured, bought, or threatened into silence, he would use the decentralized nature of the internet to ensure the information couldn't be suppressed. Multiple uploads to different platforms, simultaneous releases across various forums and networks, a coordinated information dump that would be impossible to contain. He started with the most dramatic piece of evidence, a compressed video file containing the key segments of the footage he had discovered, along with audio from Kubrick's confession. The file was small enough to upload quickly, but compelling enough to grab immediate attention. He posted it to 3 different video sharing platforms simultaneously, using different accounts and different titles to avoid automated detection systems. Next came the documents themselves. Julian uploaded them to several file-sharing sites, encrypted archives on peer-to-peer networks, and even old-fashioned bulletin board systems that were still maintained by privacy advocates and conspiracy researchers. Each upload was accompanied by a detailed explanation of how the evidence had been discovered and what it meant for our understanding of history. The most important upload was to Celluloid Truth, a darknet archive that specialised in leaked film footage and suppressed media. The site had built a reputation for hosting materials that mainstream platforms wouldn't touch, protected by layers of encryption and distributed servers that made it nearly impossible to shut down. Julian's upload included everything: the original footage, Kubrick's confession, Demotte's documents, and a comprehensive analysis tying it all together. As he worked, Julian became aware that his time was running out. The cafe was filling up with the evening crowd, and he had noticed the same man in a brown jacket nursing a coffee near the front entrance for the past hour. Every few minutes the man would glance in Julian's direction, then return to reading his newspaper. Julian forced himself to remain calm and continue working. He uploaded the files to social media platforms, embedding them in posts that would be automatically shared across multiple networks. He sent copies to dozens of journalists, researchers and activists, people who had built careers on exposing government deception and corporate cover-ups. The key was to make the information so widespread, so public, that suppressing it would require shutting down half the internet. By the time the authorities realised what was happening, millions of people would have already seen the evidence. Julian's final upload was to his own social media accounts, a simple post that read, "The truth about Apollo 11 is finally here. Everything we've been told is a lie. Kubrick's moon, space hoax, truth at last," with links to all the uploaded files. As soon as he hit the post button, Julian's computer screen flickered and went black. The man in the brown jacket was walking toward him, and Julian could see 2 more men entering through the back exit. They had found him. Julian grabbed his backpack and the remaining thumb drives, then bolted for the emergency exit. An alarm sounded as he pushed through the door, but he was already running down the alley behind the building. Behind him, he could hear shouting and the sound of pursuit. The next few hours passed in a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. Julian ditched his car and took a bus to the airport, then bought a ticket to the first flight leaving the city, a red-eye to Seattle that would get him as far away from Denver as possible. As the plane took off, he watched the city lights disappear below and wondered if he would ever feel safe again. But even as he fled, Julian could see that his plan was working. His phone, carefully set to monitor the uploads, showed that the files were spreading rapidly across the internet. The Celluloid Truth upload had been viewed 100,000 times in the first hour. Social media was exploding with shares, comments and analysis. The story was going viral faster than any suppression effort could contain it. Major news outlets were already picking up the story, though most were treating it with skepticism. "New Moon Landing Hoax Claims Surface Online," read one headline. "Internet Conspiracy Theory. Links Stanley Kubrick to faked Apollo footage, read another. But buried in the dismissive coverage was acknowledgement that the evidence was unusually sophisticated and difficult to immediately debunk. Julian smiled grimly as he read the early responses. The mainstream media's initial skepticism was exactly what he had expected, but it wouldn't last. The evidence was too compelling, too detailed, too well documented to be dismissed as another internet conspiracy theory. Experts would examine the footage, authenticate the documents, verify the audio recordings. The truth would emerge, slowly but inevitably. But even as he celebrated this initial success, Julian knew that the real battle was just beginning. The people who had orchestrated the original deception wouldn't give up easily. They would launch a counter-offensive, discrediting the evidence, attacking his credibility, spreading disinformation to muddy the waters. More dangerously, they would continue their efforts to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their secret. Julian's public exposure had bought him some protection. Killing him now would only validate his claims, but it wouldn't stop them from going after the others. Livia Reeve, the surviving technicians, anyone else who could provide corroboration for his story. As the plane descended towards Seattle, Julian made a decision. He couldn't just release the evidence and hope for the best. He had to stay engaged, continue fighting, help the truth emerge despite all the efforts to suppress it. He had started something that couldn't be stopped, but it would need constant attention and protection to reach its full potential. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The safe house in the hills above Seattle was provided by a network of investigative journalists and whistleblower advocates who specialised in protecting people who had exposed government secrets. Julian had been there for 3 days, watching the internet explode with debate about his revelations, while trying to stay ahead of the forces that were undoubtedly hunting for him. The initial response had been everything he had hoped for and feared. The evidence was spreading faster than any containment effort could stop it, but the counterattack was already beginning. Within 24 hours of his upload, several fact-checking websites had published detailed debunkings of his claims, complete with expert testimony and technical analysis that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The debunking efforts followed a predictable pattern. First, they acknowledged that the footage appeared authentic, but suggested it was part of an elaborate art project or film school experiment. Then they produced experts who claimed the audio analysis was flawed, that the voice wasn't really Kubrick's, that the documents were sophisticated forgeries. Most damaging was a story that appeared in a major technology publication, claiming that Julian himself was a fabrication, that Julian Maris was actually the pseudonym of a known conspiracy theorist with a history of creating fake evidence for internet hoaxes. The story included a detailed biography of this fictional person, complete with photographs and social media profiles that had obviously been hastily created. Julian watched the disinformation campaign unfold with a mixture of admiration and horror. The speed and sophistication of the response demonstrated that he was dealing with an organisation that had decades of experience in managing information and controlling narratives. They weren't just denying his claims, they were systematically undermining his credibility and creating alternative explanations for every piece of evidence he had presented. But the most chilling development came on his 4th day in the safe house. A news report from New York announced that Livia Reeve had died in her apartment, apparently the victim of a home invasion robbery. The report mentioned that nothing appeared to have been stolen, but that the elderly woman had suffered a fatal heart attack during the break-in. Julian stared at the television screen, knowing with absolute certainty that Livia's death was not a random crime. She had been eliminated because his revelations had made her too dangerous to leave alive. The guilt was overwhelming. He had gotten an innocent woman killed by dragging her into his investigation. The news report was followed by an interview with a supposed expert on conspiracy theories, who used Livia's death to reinforce the debunking narrative. This tragic incident shows how dangerous these internet hoaxes can be, the expert said. When false claims go viral, they can put innocent people at risk from unstable individuals who believe the misinformation. Julian turned off the television and began pacing the small living room of the safe house. The counterattack was more sophisticated than he had anticipated. They weren't just denying the evidence, they were using the very consequences of their own actions to discredit his claims. Livia's murder had been turned into a weapon against the truth she had died trying to protect. His phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. The number was blocked, but Julian answered anyway, knowing that his location was already compromised. "Mr. Maris?" The voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of an accent that Julian couldn't place. "My name is David Sinclair. I represent certain interests that would like to speak with you." "Let me guess," Julian said. "You want to offer me money to recant my story. Or maybe you want to threaten me into silence." "Neither, actually. We want to offer you the truth." Julian paused, caught off guard by the unexpected response. "What do you mean?" "The story you've uncovered is more complex than you realise. Yes, Stanley Kubrick was involved in creating footage related to the Apollo program, but the footage wasn't used to fake the moon landing. It was used to hide something much more important. Something that, if revealed, would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of its place in the universe." "You're saying the moon landing really happened?" "I'm saying that what happened on the moon was so extraordinary, so far beyond what the public was prepared to accept, that a cover story had to be created. Kubrick's footage wasn't used to fake the landing. It was used to hide what the astronauts actually found up there." Julian felt his worldview shifting again. And what did they find? Evidence that humanity is not alone in the universe. Structures on the lunar surface that were clearly not created by natural processes. Technology that was far beyond anything we had developed. Proof that someone else had been there first. The caller let this sink in for a moment before continuing. The decision was made at the highest levels of government that the public couldn't handle the truth. The psychological, social and religious implications would have been catastrophic. So they created a simpler narrative. Brave astronauts taking humanity's first steps into space, while hiding the reality that we had discovered we were not the first. Julian sank into a chair, trying to process what he was hearing. "You're saying the whole conspiracy theory is backwards?" "I'm saying that the truth is more complex than either the official story or the conspiracy theories suggest. Yes, there was deception. Yes, footage was faked. But not to hide failure, to hide a success that was too dangerous to reveal." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your investigation has created a crisis. The evidence you've released is accurate as far as it goes, but it's incomplete. It's leading people toward a truth that they're not prepared to handle. We need your help to manage the situation, to guide the revelation in a way that won't cause mass panic or social collapse." Julian laughed bitterly. "You want me to help you cover up the cover-up?" "We want you to help us reveal the truth gradually, responsibly. To prepare humanity for a reality that will fundamentally change everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our place in the cosmos." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Sinclair outlining a plan for managed disclosure that would slowly prepare the public for the revelation of extraterrestrial contact. Julian listened with growing skepticism, recognizing the sophisticated manipulation tactics that were being employed. When the call ended, Julian was more convinced than ever that he was dealing with an organization that would say anything, promise anything, create any narrative necessary to protect their secrets. The story about alien artifacts on the moon was probably just another layer of deception, designed to confuse and misdirect anyone who got too close to the truth. But the call had confirmed one thing. His revelations were having an impact. The fact that they were willing to contact him directly, to offer him alternative explanations and opportunities for cooperation, meant that they were worried. The truth was getting out despite their best efforts to contain it. Julian made a decision. He wouldn't be intimidated, bribed or deceived into abandoning his investigation. He would continue pushing for the truth, no matter how complex or dangerous it became. The public deserved to know what their government had done, what lies they had been told, what secrets had been kept from them for more than half a century. As he prepared to leave the safe house and continue his investigation, Julian reflected on how much his life had changed since he first discovered that unmarked reel of film. He had started as a simple film restorer and become a fugitive, a truth-teller, a guardian of one of the most explosive secrets in human history. The game was far from over, and Julian was beginning to understand that the real truth might be stranger and more complex than anything he had imagined. But whatever the complete story might be, he was committed to uncovering it and sharing it with the world, no matter what the cost might be to himself or others. The truth he had learned was not just a destination, but a journey, one that might lead to places he had never imagined, and revelations that would change everything he thought he knew about reality itself. 2 weeks later, Julian Maris disappeared. His rental car was found abandoned in a remote area of Olympic National Forest, the keys still in the ignition, his personal belongings scattered across the front seat, as if he had left in a hurry. The official investigation concluded that he had become disoriented while hiking, and had likely fallen into one of the area's many ravines or been attacked by wildlife. No body was ever found. The media coverage of his disappearance was brief and dismissive. Most outlets described him as a conspiracy theorist, who had been troubled by the negative response to his claims about the moon landing. The implication was clear. He had either committed suicide in despair or fled to avoid the consequences of his hoax. Within a month, Julian's apartment in Georgetown was sold to new owners who claimed to have no knowledge of the previous tenant. His employment records at the American Film Archive were quietly purged, leaving no official trace that he had ever worked there. His social media accounts were deleted, his bank accounts closed, his entire digital footprint systematically erased. To the outside world, Julian Maris had simply never existed, but the evidence he had uploaded continued to circulate in the darker corners of the internet, shared among conspiracy researchers and truth seekers who recognized its significance. The footage, the documents, the audio recordings, all of it remained available to anyone willing to look hard enough, serving as a persistent reminder that some secrets were too big to stay buried forever. The official response to Julian's revelations followed the predictable pattern of denial, debunking, and disinformation. Government spokesmen dismissed the evidence as sophisticated but ultimately unconvincing fabrications. NASA held press conferences featuring experts who methodically dismantled each claim with technical arguments that sounded authoritative but were designed more to confuse than to clarify. The mainstream media largely ignored the story after the initial burst of coverage, treating it as just another internet conspiracy theory unworthy of serious attention. When the story was mentioned at all, it was usually in the context of discussions about the dangers of misinformation and the gullibility of people who believed what they read online. But in the months that followed Julian's disappearance, strange things began to happen to others who had been connected to the original project. A retired NASA engineer died in a suspicious car accident after announcing his intention to write a memoir about the Apollo program. A former Air Force photographer was found dead in his home from an apparent drug overdose, despite having no history of substance abuse. A movie industry technician who had worked at Lookout Mountain Laboratory in the late 1960s died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 58. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The final phase of the cleanup operation was underway, the elimination of anyone who might be able to corroborate Julian's claims or provide additional evidence of the deception. Lieutenant Column Warren DeMott died peacefully in his Montana ranch house exactly 3 months after Julian's visit, his lung cancer progressing precisely as the doctors had predicted. His death attracted no attention beyond a brief obituary in the local newspaper. The ranch was sold quickly to an anonymous buyer who immediately demolished the house and converted the property to grazing land. Among DeMott's effects, investigators found a handwritten note that read simply, "The truth is bigger than any of us realized. I'm sorry for my part in keeping it hidden." The note was dismissed by authorities as the confused ramblings of a dying man, possibly influenced by the conspiracy theories that had been circulating online. The truth, it seemed, had died with the last of those who had lived it. But in the final scene of this particular drama, there was one last twist that even the architects of the cover-up hadn't anticipated. A small television station in Nebraska was preparing a retrospective program about the Apollo missions when their archivist discovered something unusual in their old footage collections. Buried among reels of routine news coverage from 1972 was a brief segment that had apparently never been broadcast. containing an interview with an unidentified man who claimed to have worked on a secret government film project. The footage was grainy and the audio was poor, but the man's voice was unmistakably that of Stanley Kubrick. And his words, spoken more than 50 years ago to a reporter who had probably long since forgotten the interview, contained a cryptic message that seemed to speak directly to the present moment. "In the end," Kubrick's voice whispered from the television speakers, barely audible above the static and interference, "the truth is not what you can see, it's what they won't let you question." The station aired the footage as part of their Apollo retrospective, presenting it as a curiosity from their archives, without understanding its significance. But for those few viewers who recognised the voice and understood the implications, it served as a final confirmation of everything Julian Maris had died trying to reveal. The greatest lie in human history had been exposed, but only to those who were willing to see it. The official narrative remained intact, protected by layers of denial, disinformation, and the simple human tendency to believe what was comfortable rather than what was true. And somewhere in the shadows, the machine that had been built to protect this secret continued to operate, watching, waiting, ready to eliminate any new threats that might emerge. Because some truths, the guardians of the secret believed, were too dangerous for humanity to handle. The moon continued to shine in the night sky, a silent witness to the greatest deception ever perpetrated. But for those who knew where to look, who understood what questions to ask, its light seemed somehow different. Not the beacon of human achievement it had once appeared to be, but a reminder that even our greatest triumphs might be nothing more than carefully constructed illusions. The truth was out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next Julian Maris to stumble upon it and risk everything to bring it into the light. Because no matter how sophisticated the cover-up, how thorough the elimination of evidence, how complete the control of information, there would always be someone willing to ask the questions that weren't supposed to be asked. And in the end, that might be enough to ensure that even the greatest lies couldn't last forever. The story of Kubrick's moon had ended, but the search for truth continued, carried forward by those who refused to accept that some secrets were too dangerous to reveal. The moon landing conspiracy had been exposed, but the deeper questions it raised about truth, power, and the nature of reality itself remained as relevant as ever. In a world where reality itself had become a contested battlefield, where the line between truth and fiction grew ever more blurred, the story of Julian Maris served as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about the price of seeking forbidden knowledge, and an inspiration for those who believed that no truth was too dangerous to be told. The credits rolled on this particular story, but the larger narrative of humanity's relationship with truth and power continued to unfold, one frame at a time, in the endless reel of history that would never stop running.